What would you do if the whole town laughed the day you became a landowner? For Wren Calloway, a woman with nothing left but a dead man's debts and a signature on an auction ledger, that laughter was the sound of her new life beginning. Not a metaphor, not a memory. The actual ringing sound of 30 strangers finding her humiliation funny enough to repeat to their neighbors for weeks. She had just paid $5 for a shack the county couldn't give away. It sat on 11 acres of cracked red dirt at the dead end of Cistern Road, where the desert stopped pretending to be anything but desert. No water rights worth the paper. No grazing worth the fence posts. A leaning one-room structure with a collapsed porch and a door that hung by a single hinge, like a mouth left open in permanent surprise. But what she found beneath that shack, in the weeks that followed, would drag up a silver vein and a 30-year murder that the town of Amberlode had spent a generation trying to bury under its own prosperity. Settle in. This is a story about the value of the things men throw away and the truth buried just beneath them. The gavel came down light, almost apologetic, as if the auctioneer himself was embarrassed by the number. $5, sold to the young lady in the gray coat. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd gathered on the courthouse steps in Amberlode, Arizona territory. Not cruel exactly, but worse than cruel. Amused. The kind of laughter reserved for something too small to be worth real contempt. Wren kept her spine straight and her eyes forward, the way her mother had taught her to stand in church when the collection plate came around empty. She had exactly $6.40 to her name after the auction fee, a single trunk of belongings, and a folded deed to 11 acres nobody in 3 counties had bid on until she raised her hand. Behind her, a man's voice pitched to Carrie. "Congratulations, Miss Calloway. You've bought yourself the finest patch of nothing in the territory." That was Dobbs Preed, not the richest man in Amberlode. That title belonged to his father, Augustus, but rich enough and cruel in the particular way of men who have never once had to be otherwise. He wore a coat too fine for a Tuesday and a smile too wide for a stranger's misfortune. "It's mine, though," Wren said, quiet, even. Which is more than most men in this crowd can say about anything. The laughter died a little at that. Not all the way, but enough. 6 months ago, Wren Calloway had been a school teacher in a Tucson parish, with a modest room above a bakery and a life she had assumed, with the quiet certainty of the young, would simply continue. Then the parish school had closed for lack of funds, and the room above the bakery had gone to a family who could pay for it. And within the space of a single hard spring, she had learned exactly how thin the floor beneath an ordinary life could be. She had taken in mending. She had sold her mother's silver hairbrush, and then her mother's silver thimble, and then there had been nothing silver left to sell at all. She had come to Amberlode with a name and an address scratched onto the back of an old assay report, the last possession of her Uncle Cassius, a man she had met exactly 4 times in her life, and buried alone 6 weeks ago in a Tucson churchyard, his lungs finally giving out from 30 years of desert dust. He had left her nothing but debts, a single unpaid tax lien on a worthless plot of land, and a note in his crabbed hand that she had read so many times the folds were beginning to split. "Wren, don't let them have Cistern Road, whatever it costs you." See, she hadn't understood it. She still didn't. But $6.40 was cheap enough for a mystery, and it was the only inheritance in the world with her name already on it. Dobbs Preed's smile thinned as she walked past him toward the wagon that would carry her out to her new, worthless kingdom. "You won't last the season," he called after her. She didn't turn around, but she filed the words away, the way she filed away everything men said when they believed a woman couldn't hear the threat underneath the joke. Before she ever reached the courthouse steps, she had stopped at the edge of a dry wash on the outskirts of town, needing a moment alone to gather herself before facing the auction. An old man was there, sifting patiently through the gravel with a tin pan, his eyes a startling pale blue and a face that was a roadmap of wrinkles. He looked up as she approached, then at the cracked earth around them, then at the cloudless sky, as though reading a message written across all three. "Driest ground remembers the deepest water," he said, not quite to her, more to the air itself, his voice like stones grinding together. "And the poorest-looking claim remembers the richest vein. Folks forget that. Every single time." She had thanked him for the thought, more out of politeness than belief, and walked on toward the courthouse without giving the words a second glance, dismissing them as the rambling of a sun-touched old man who'd spent too many years panning gravel that held nothing. Weeks later, lying awake in the dark with a silver-shot chamber humming beneath her floorboards, she would remember them again and understand them as something closer to prophecy than rambling. That same afternoon, flush with the strange, hollow triumph of owning land nobody else wanted, she had gone looking for the county clerk's office to file her deed, and her path had carried her through the front doors of the Amberlode saloon by mistake, drawn in by a hand-lettered sign she'd misread in the glare. The room was thick with pipe smoke and the sour smell of old whiskey, and her question to the bartender, quiet, half embarrassed, had been enough to draw the attention of a table in the corner. Dobbs Preed sat there, flanked by two men whose faces had been worn blank by years of doing exactly what they were told and asking nothing in return. His laugh, when it came, was loud enough to fill the whole room. "Claim, Miss Calloway, the only thing a woman claims free and clear in this valley is a husband." His men had chuckled on cue, well rehearsed in the rhythm of it. "That patch of desert your uncle left you isn't worth the filing fee, barren rock and rattlesnakes." The public humiliation had stung, but it was the cold, possessive light that had moved behind his eyes a half-second later that she remembered most, long after the laughter had faded. He hadn't simply been mocking her, he had been warning her. Some part of him, she would understand only much later, had already known exactly what sat beneath that shack, and had already decided, long before she ever raised her hand at that auction, that it belonged to his family and no one else. The shack was worse in person than it had been on paper. Its roof sagged in the middle like a sway-backed mule. The single window was cracked in a spiderweb pattern that caught the last orange light of evening and scattered it across the dirt floor. Something had been living in the walls, judging by the droppings, and something else, larger, had been living in the crawlspace beneath the floorboards, judging by the way they groaned under her boots. She swept it out with a broom made of mesquite branches lashed together with twine, because that was all she had, and she slept that first night on a bedroll on the swept dirt, listening to the wind find every gap in the walls and turn each one into a low, mournful note. It should have been the loneliest night of her life, but it wasn't. Somewhere beneath the floor, in the deep hours after midnight, she heard something that was not the wind. A sound like breathing, slow and cavernous, the exhale of something enormous and patient, drawn up through the cracks in the floorboards and gone before she could be certain she hadn't dreamed it. She lay rigid in the dark for a long moment, her heart hammering against her ribs. Then nothing. Just the wind again, ordinary and thin. In the morning she told herself it had been a dream. The desert did that to newcomers, filled their first nights with sounds that daylight always dissolved. She built a fire from broken porch slats, boiled the last of her coffee grounds twice to make them stretch, and told herself that tomorrow she would start walking the property line, because a woman with $6 to her name could not afford to be spooked by her own house settling. But she remembered her uncle's note. Don't let them have Cistern Road, whatever it costs you. A man did not write a warning like that about a house that only breathed dirt and dust. It took her 4 days to find the cellar door. She found it the way people find most important things in this world, by accident, while doing something else entirely. She was clearing brush from behind the shack, trying to see if there was enough flat ground for a garden, when her mattock struck something that rang instead of thudded. Iron, buried under 6 inches of blown sand and 80 years of neglect. She dug with her hands until her nails split, and what emerged from the earth was a trapdoor, warped but intact, sealed with a rusted padlock that crumbled to orange flakes the moment she struck it with a rock. The hinges screamed like something waking from a long sleep. Below her, a set of hand-cut stone steps descended into a darkness so complete it seemed to have weight. A slow current of cool air rose up to meet her face, carrying the mineral smell of deep stone and something else beneath it, something sweeter, sharper. The smell of old smoke that had never quite left a room. She stood there for a long time at the edge of that darkness, one hand braced on the splintered doorframe, and she thought about her uncle's crabbed handwriting, and the tax lien nobody else in 3 counties had wanted, and the way Dobbs Preed's smile had thinned when she'd bought this land instead of letting it rot. Whatever it costs you. It was not a question anymore. It was the only choice she'd ever really had. She lit the stub of a candle and she went down. What would you do if the ground beneath your own worthless house held a secret men had killed to keep buried? Because that was what Wren Calloway found at the bottom of those stone steps. Not a cellar, not a root pit for storing potatoes through the winter, but a mine shaft. Hand-cut, timbered with old mesquite beams gone gray and brittle, sloping downward into the dark with the unmistakable, deliberate geometry of men who had once known exactly what they were digging for. Let us know in the comments, would you have kept going or turned back? She kept going. Of course she kept going. Some decisions aren't decisions at all. They're just the shape a person's whole life has been sharpening toward. The passage ran nearly 200 feet before it opened into a chamber, and when her candle caught the far wall, Wren stopped breathing entirely. Silver. Not coins, not ingots, raw, unworked veins of it, threading through the gray rock like lightning frozen mid-strike, catching the candlelight and throwing it back tenfold. A fortune, embedded in stone that had been sitting untouched under her own collapsing shack for longer than she had been alive. But it wasn't the silver that made her hands shake. It was the rest of the chamber. A row of mining tools, rusted where they'd been dropped and never picked back up. A pickaxe still leaning against the wall exactly where someone had set it down mid-shift. A tin dinner pail, its lid still latched, sitting on a ledge as if its owner meant to come back for it in an hour. And at the far end of the chamber, half buried under a rockfall that had clearly not been an accident of geology but the deliberate work of dynamite, a scrap of blue calico shirt, faded nearly to gray, caught between 2 stones. This was not an abandoned mine. This was a grave that had never been marked. She backed away slowly, her candle guttering, the weight of the silence pressing down on her chest like something physical. Whatever had happened here, it had happened fast, and it had happened to men who never got the chance to walk back up those stone steps. Along the far wall, she found a row of 6 more tools set down in the same abandoned haste, a shovel leaning at an angle no careful man would leave it, a coil of fuse cord gone brittle and gray, a second dinner pail with its contents long since rotted to dust inside. 6 tools, she counted, and a 7th set slightly apart, near the pickaxe, as though its owner had been standing a little removed from the others when whatever happened here happened. 7 men. The number settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending out ripples she didn't yet have the full shape of. Carved into the timber support nearest the rock fall, faint but unmistakable under a layer of dust, was a single word scratched by a pocket knife in a hand grown desperate. Run. She did not need to be told twice what that word meant, or how little time its author had been given to act on it. Tucked into a crevice near the pickaxe, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age, she found a leather satchel. Inside it, A small, hand-drawn survey map of the shaft and a single folded letter, the ink faded to the color of weak tea, addressed to no one and signed with an initial she recognized immediately, because she had read it 100 times folded into the back of an assay report. See, her Uncle Cassius had been here. Not just heard of this place. Been here in this chamber among these tools, before whatever happened to seal it shut and erase it from every record in Amberlode. She sat down hard on the cold stone floor, the letter trembling in her hands, and for the first time since the auctioneer's gavel had come down on her humiliation, Wren Calloway understood that the joke had never been on her. It had been on everyone who assumed a $5 plot of desert had nothing worth taking. She didn't hear him come in. That was the first thing that unsettled her, that a grown man could cross open ground and descend a set of creaking stone steps without a sound reaching her ears until his shadow fell across the chamber floor. Candle raised like a weapon, she spun to face him, and found herself looking at a man of perhaps 40, whether the way rope gets weathered, standing very still at the mouth of the passage with his hat in his hands as though he'd walked into a church by mistake. "You shouldn't be down here," he said. His voice was low, rough at the edges, the voice of a man who didn't use it often enough to keep it smooth. "It's my land," Wren said, and was proud of how steady it came out. "I know whose land it is." He looked past her to the rockfall, to the scrap of faded calico caught between the stones, and something moved through his face that she recognized because she had felt the same thing an hour ago. Grief, old and unhealed, meeting a fact it had never been allowed to have. "You know this place," she said. "It wasn't a question. My brother worked this claim. His jaw worked once, twice, before the rest came out. 31 years ago, him and 6 other men. The official record says the shaft flooded and they all made it out alive and moved on to other work." He finally looked at her directly. "I buried an empty coffin for my brother because there wasn't enough of him left to fill one, and the man who told me the flooding story stood at that funeral with his hat over his heart." "Who?" "Augustus Preed." He said the name like it cost him something to spend it. He owned the mining company, still owns half this valley. Wren felt the pieces beginning to align themselves, slow and terrible, like tumblers falling into place inside a lock. "My uncle knew something," she said. "He left me this land in a note that made no sense until an hour ago." The stranger studied her for a long moment. "Name's Ezra Hollies," he said finally. "I've got a ranch 2 miles east, and I've spent 31 years wondering what really happened down here. I came out because I saw candlelight through that busted trapdoor and figured either a fool or a ghost was down in the Preed mine." "It's not the Preed mine," Wren said. "It's mine. I bought it for $5. Something that might, in a kinder decade, have been a smile crossed Ezra Hollies' face. "Then I reckon," he said, "you bought yourself a lot more than you paid for." Trust out in that country was not a thing men gave easily, and Wren understood that Ezra Hollies had spent 31 years learning not to give it at all. But grief recognizes grief the way water finds the lowest ground, and by the second hour in that chamber, working together by lantern light to pry open the satchel's remaining contents, something had shifted between them that neither one named out loud. Inside the satchel, beneath the map and the letter, they found a second, smaller journal, its pages brittle and foxed with age, written in a hand so careful it looked almost like typeset print. It belonged to a man named Josiah Vane, the actual owner of the Cistern Road silver claim, and its first entry was dated 31 years and 4 months ago. "Augustus Preed came to see me again today," it read. "He offered $40 an acre for a claim he swears is worthless. The same claim his own asser told me in private was carrying silver richer than anything east of the Bradshaws. I told him no. I will tell him no every day until he stops asking. A man who lies about the value of dirt is a man planning to steal what's under it." Wren read the entry twice, her mouth dry. "Vane," Ezra said quietly. "That's the name that's supposed to be on the original deed." County records say he sold out and moved to California before the mine ever opened. He shook his head slowly. Nobody ever saw him leave. They read on by lantern light, the passages growing shorter and more hurried as the weeks in the journal wore on. A Josiah Vane describing threats delivered by men in fine coats, a fire that took his barn, a bank in Amberlode that suddenly called in a loan he'd never missed a payment on. And then 3 entries from the end, a single line that made the chamber feel colder than the stone around them. They know I've hidden the real assay reports. They know I won't sell. I've buried the proof where only my own blood will think to look, under the floor of the lined shack on the Cistern Road claim, where Cassius keeps watch when I can't. If anything happens to me, it will be up to him, or whoever comes after him, to bring this into the light. Cassius, Wren whispered. My uncle wasn't a stranger to this mine. He was Josiah Vane's man. He kept watch. The last entry in the journal was dated the day of the cave-in. Preed says he'll give me one more chance to sell fair. Meet me at the shaft tonight to discuss terms. I don't trust him, but I trust the law less if it comes to a fight I can't win alone. Going anyway. God help the men working the night shift if I'm wrong about him. Ezra closed the journal with hands that had gone very still. There was no flood, he said, his voice a flat, cold thing. There was dynamite, and my brother was on that night shift. They sat with that for a long moment, the lantern hissing softly between them, before Wren turned back to the satchel and found, tucked into its bottom seam, a second bundle of papers she had missed the first time through, bank drafts, land transfers, a running tally in a hand she now recognized as Cassius's own careful, cramped script. It was, she realized as she read, an accounting kept by a frightened but methodical man, a decade's worth of proof assembled in secret by someone who understood he might not live to testify to any of it himself. Every acre Augustus Preed had acquired in the 2 years following the cave-in was listed here, cross-referenced against a foreclosure, a sudden fire, a suspiciously convenient bankruptcy. The mercantile that had failed the same month its owner refused to sell his water rights. The freight line that collapsed after its foreman testified, briefly, and only once, that he'd heard blasting powder ordered for a claim that officially used none. The freight line's foreman, the ledger noted in her uncle's small, careful hand, had left the territory within the week and was never heard from again. He wasn't just watching this claim, Wren said quietly. He was watching the whole valley, building a case 1 page at a time for 30 years, and never once had anyone he trusted enough to hand it to. Until you, Ezra said. Until whoever came after him. She folded the ledger closed with hands that weren't quite steady. He didn't know it would be me. He just knew someone had to be left standing who cared enough to keep digging. Ezra was quiet for a while, turning his hat slowly in his hands the way a man turns something over when he isn't ready to look up yet. My brother's name was Nathaniel, he said finally. He wasn't but 19. Wrote to our mother every month regular as Sunday, right up until the month the letters stopped, and a stranger showed up instead with a hat in his hands, and a story about floodwater in a shaft that hadn't seen rain in 6 weeks. He looked at the rockfall again, at the faded scrap of calico still caught between the stones. I always knew, down in my gut, where a man knows things he can't prove. I just never had a single page of paper to put in front of anybody who mattered. You have a whole satchel of them now, Wren said. We have a whole satchel of them now, Ezra corrected, and something in the way he said it settled a weight in Wren's chest that had been sitting there, unnamed, since the moment the auctioneer's gavel first came down on her humiliation. For Ezra Hollies, the truth was a poison he had been waiting 31 years to be handed, and now that it was finally in his hands, it burned worse than the not knowing ever had. The doctor who'd signed the false death certificates had built the finest house in Amberlode. The sheriff who'd closed the investigation in 11 days had been re-elected 6 times running, unopposed, because no one dared run a campaign against a man Augustus Preed had personally endorsed. The bank that had foreclosed on Josiah Vane's assets within a month of his disappearance had used those very assets, this claim, this shaft, this silver, as collateral to expand into 3 neighboring counties. An entire town's prosperity, built on the unmarked graves of 7 men and 1 silenced landowner. "This is bigger than a mine," Ezra said, staring at the rockfall as if he could see through it to the men still buried beneath. "This is the whole valley, built on a lie." Wren looked at the scrap of faded calico still caught between the stones, and thought of her Uncle Cassius, dying alone in a Tucson boarding house with nothing to his name but a note he'd been too afraid, or too careful, to make any plainer than whatever it costs you. "Then it's a lie somebody has to answer for," she said. The plan formed slow, the way plans do when the people making them have too much to lose and no experience losing carefully. They would document everything: the journal, the survey map, the letter, and whatever else they could recover from that chamber before anyone in Amberlode learned the shack on Cistern Road had a new owner willing to dig where the old owner had been forced to stop. They would carry the proof to the territorial mining commissioner in Prescott, a man with no debts owed to Augustus Preed, and they would let the law finish what a dynamite charge had once tried to bury for good. It was a good plan. 4 days was as long as it survived. For 3 of those 4 days, though, before trouble found them, there was something almost peaceful in the work. Ezra came by each morning under the thin excuse of checking on a fence line that didn't need checking, and stayed each evening under no excuse at all. And between them, they began the slow, careful business of turning a satchel full of grief into something that could stand up in a courtroom. They copied pages by lamplight, Wren's careful schoolteacher's hand duplicating each entry of the ledger twice over, once for Prescott, and once hidden separately in case the first copy never arrived. Ezra split their remaining silver sample and buried half of it beneath a fence post 2 miles distant, a hedge against the possibility that everything in this house might be taken from them before they ever left it. On the 3rd evening, exhausted, ink-stained, sitting on the sagging porch step with the desert cooling fast around them, Ezra spoke without quite looking at her. "After my brother died after the funeral with the empty box, I built that ranch out of spite more than anything else," he said. "Told myself I'd stay 2 miles from this claim my whole life just so nobody could ever say I ran from it. 31 years of spite is a long time to build a life on." "And now?" Wren asked. "Now I've got something better to build on." He glanced at her, and there was nothing performed in it, nothing like the easy confidence Dobbs Preed wore like a coat. Just a tired, honest man saying a true thing out loud for what might have been the first time in 3 decades. "Figured I'd tell you that before either one of us gets shot trying to prove a dead man's ledger to a stranger in Prescott." Wren found she didn't have a schoolteacher's careful answer for that. She only reached over and took his hand, ink-stained fingers against calloused ones, and they sat like that a while as the first stars came out over the valley that had taken so much from both of them, and perhaps was finally about to give a little of it back. The rider came at dusk on the 4th day, and Wren knew trouble by the unhurried way he approached, the same unhurried confidence Dobbs Preed had worn on the courthouse steps. His name, she would learn later, was Corliss Raid, foreman of Augustus Preed's cattle operation, and less officially, the man who handled problems too delicate for a sheriff already compromised. He sat his horse at the edge of her property with the easy patience of a man who had all the time in the world, because time, like everything else in this valley, belonged to his employer. "Miss Calloway," he called out, not bothering to dismount. "Mr. Preed sends his regards and a fair offer. $200 for a plot of land he's told me himself ain't worth the paper on the deed." "Then why offer $200 for it?" Wren called back, standing in her doorway with her arms crossed, her heart hammering so hard she was certain he could see it through her coat. Raid's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes went flat and calculating. "Generosity," he said. "A parting gift, seeing as you won't last the season anyhow." He rode off without waiting for an answer, and Wren understood, watching his dust settle on the road, that the offer had never been the point. The offer had been a test, a way to see whether a $5 landowner would fold at the first real pressure, and whether she understood yet what she'd actually bought. She did understand. And she had no intention of folding. That night, she and Ezra loaded the journal, the letter, and the survey map into a saddlebag, along with a chunk of raw silver ore heavy enough to prove the claim's value beyond any argument, and made ready to ride for Prescott before first light. They never made it out of the yard. The storm came in off the mountains fast and mean, the kind of desert cloudburst that turns dry arroyos into brown, roaring rivers inside of 20 minutes, and it caught them exactly as they were saddling the horses in the dark. Lightning cracked white across the yard, and in that single frozen instant, Wren saw coreless Raid standing at the mouth of her own barn, rifle already raised, rain sheeting off the brim of his hat. "Figured you'd try to run," he said, his voice carrying easy over the rising wind. "Mr. Preed don't like loose ends, and you, Miss Calloway, have become the loosest end this valley's had in 31 years. There was no time for a plan. There was barely time to think. As Raid's finger tightened on the trigger, Ezra threw the lantern he'd been carrying, and the yard plunged into a darkness broken only by strobing lightning and the driving rain. The shot went wide, the muzzle flash lighting Raid's snarling face for half a heartbeat before the dark swallowed it again. What followed was ugly and close, and entirely without the clean choreography of a fair fight. Ezra went low, driving his shoulder into Raid's midsection, and the two men crashed against the barn wall in a tangle of limbs and rain-slick mud. Wren, her heart slamming against her ribs, grabbed the only weapon within reach, a fence post leaning against the door, and swung it blind into the churning dark. It connected with a sound she would hear in her dreams for years afterward. Raid went down and stayed down, his rifle skittering across the mud, and for a long, ringing moment there was only the sound of the storm and their own ragged breathing. For a moment neither of them moved, the rain hammering down around them, the only light the distant, dying flicker of the lantern's spilled oil still burning itself out against the wet mud. Wren's hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the fence post, and it was only when Ezra called her name, low and urgent, that she managed to loosen her grip on it at all. "He'll wake up," Ezra said finally, dragging himself upright, wiping rain and blood from his face. "And when he does, he'll tell Preed exactly what we're carrying and exactly where we're headed." They bound Raid's wrists with harness leather before the sun came up, and by the gray, washed light of dawn, with the storm grumbling away east and the arroyos still running brown and swollen, Wren Calloway understood that there was no version of this story left where she quietly walked away from Cistern Road. She had crossed a line the moment she'd lit that first candle at the bottom of the stone steps. There was no going back now. There was only forward, toward Prescott, and toward whatever justice a territorial commissioner could still deliver to 7 dead men and 1 silenced claim. They rode 2 days to reach Prescott, bypassing Amberlode entirely under cover of the pre-dawn dark, their bound prisoner slung uneasy across a 3rd horse and glaring hatred at both of them the entire way. They stopped only to rest the animals, their faces set with the particular grim determination of people who have stopped being afraid of the thing ahead of them because the thing behind them is worse. On the second morning, cresting a low ridge to check their back trail, Ezra went very still in the saddle, his hand rising slow to shade his eyes. Dust. 3 riders far off yet, but closing at a pace that meant business rather than idle travel. "Preed doesn't wait quiet for bad news," Ezra said. Raid was due back last night, By now they'll know he isn't coming, and they'll know exactly which road we'd have to take to reach a commissioner. They left the main trail within the hour, cutting instead through a stretch of broken country that Ezra knew from 30 years of running cattle across ground most men avoided. A maze of shallow washes and volcanic rock that swallowed their tracks as fast as they could make them. It cost them half a day and very nearly cost them a horse when Wren's mare stumbled through a rockslide that had looked, from 10 feet away, like solid ground. But when they finally rejoined the main road, well past dusk, the dust behind them had vanished, and the only sound on the wind was the ordinary creak of saddle leather and the distant, indifferent call of a nighthawk. "They'll try again," Ezra said quietly, watching the empty road behind them. "A man like Preed doesn't stop because one road closed. He just starts looking for another. Then we'd best make sure there isn't a road left open by the time we're through," Wren said, and put her heels to the mare. The territorial mining commissioner, a spare, exacting man named Calloway with ink-stained fingers and eyes that missed nothing, listened to their account without interruption, his only movement an occasional note scratched into the margin of a legal pad. When they finished, he sat quiet for a long moment, turning a pen slowly between two fingers before he finally spoke. "Do you understand, Miss Calloway, what you're asking this office to do?" he said. "Augustus Preed has sat on the Territorial Mining Advisory Board for 11 years. He has personally funded the re-election campaigns of 2 sitting judges in this district. If what you've brought me is true, I am not simply prosecuting a crime. I am dismantling a man's entire architecture of respectability, built brick by brick over 3 decades, in front of everyone who ever leaned on it." "With respect, Commissioner," Wren said, "that architecture was built over an unmarked grave. I don't much care how long it took him to build it or how many respectable bricks he used." Something in Calloway's exacting face eased just slightly at that. "No," he said, "I don't suppose you would." He examined the journal page by page after that, held Josiah Vane's original letter up to the window light, and had his own Assier confirm within the hour that the ore sample Wren had carried 200 miles in a saddlebag was, in fact, some of the richest silver-bearing rock he had seen in a decade of territorial surveys. "The journal is consistent with the period," the Assier confirmed quietly, turning the brittle pages with something close to reverence. "The paper, the ink, the binding, this is authentic." Faced with the evidence and Commissioner Calloway's flat, unreadable stare, Corliss Raid's bravado did not survive the first hour of questioning. He confessed to everything: the dynamite, the false flood report, the 31 years of silence purchased with a foreman's salary, and in doing so, implicated Augustus Preed in 7 murders and a landowner's disappearance that had never officially been called a murder at all. The commissioner deputized federal marshals on the spot, a quiet, procedural acknowledgement of just how far this rot had spread through a single valley's soil, and within the week, lawmen who owed nothing to the Preed name rode into Amberlode at the head of a column that the townspeople had no framework to understand. This was not local justice, bought and managed and quietly buried. This was something the town had never seen before and had no way left to stop. The arrests came swift and without ceremony. Augustus Preed was taken from behind his own desk, his face a mask of disbelief that curdled slowly into something closer to comprehension as the marshals read the charges aloud: 7 counts tied to the deaths at the Cistern Road shaft, and 1 more, added almost as an afterthought by Commissioner Calloway's clerk, for the disappearance of a claimant named Josiah Vane, whose body had never been recovered and whose name had not been spoken aloud in Amberlode in 3 decades. The sheriff was disarmed in his own office, his badge set on the desk in front of him by a federal marshal who did not so much as raise his voice to do it. The doctor who had signed 7 false death certificates was led out of his surgery still wearing his apron, a pair of scissors left forgotten on the examining table behind him. The bank manager who had approved the note calling in Josiah Vane's mortgage within a month of his disappearance was found, when the marshals arrived, quietly attempting to burn a ledger of his own in the back room, and was arrested with soot still on his fingers. One by one, the men who had built Amberlode's prosperity on an unmarked grave were revealed to the town that had trusted them, and the townspeople, the same crowd that had laughed on the courthouse steps at a woman who'd bought worthless dirt for $5, stood in stunned, complicit silence as their whole understanding of their own home came apart in the street. A woman who ran the boarding house wept openly on her porch, less for the men being led away in chains than for the 30 years she had cooked their Sunday dinners and called them good neighbors. A boy no older than 10 asked his mother, in a voice that carried further than he meant it to, whether the doctor who treated his broken arm the winter before was going to be hanged, and his mother had no honest answer that a child could carry. Dobbs Preed watched his father led away in chains from the boardwalk outside the Mercantile, and when his eyes found Wren standing across the street beside Ezra Holly's, the mockery that had lived so easily on his face was gone, replaced by something hollow and gaping, and entirely without comprehension. He was not simply defeated, he was undone. His whole inherited world erased by the woman he'd told without a flicker of doubt that she wouldn't last the season. Months passed and the valley slowly exhaled. The territorial court seized the Preed mining interests, and following the recommendations of Commissioner Calloway's own investigation, reopened the Cistern Road claim under a cooperative charter that guaranteed a fair wage and a fair share to every miner who worked it, including the surviving families of the 7 men lost in that first collapse, Ezra's brother among them, finally given the proper burial 31 years overdue. Amberlode itself changed slower than the courtroom did, the way towns always do, one uncomfortable conversation at a time. The mercantile owner who had gone quietly bankrupt a decade earlier was tracked down in California and offered restitution from the recovered Preed estate. The freight line foreman who had vanished after speaking one careless truth about blasting powder was found, eventually, alive and farming under a different name 2 territories away, and came back only long enough to give his testimony before returning, by his own choice, to the quiet life he had built rather than the one that had been taken from him. Not every wrong could be undone, but the ones that could were, one slow, deliberate correction at a time, and the town that had once laughed on the courthouse steps learned, gradually, to be a little less certain of its own easy judgments. Dobbs Preed sold what little remained to his name within the year and left the territory entirely, and no one in Amberlode much troubled themselves to ask where he'd gone. Ezra's brother Nathaniel was laid to rest that autumn in a proper plot beneath a cottonwood tree, alongside the 6 other men who had been buried in that chamber for 31 years, their names finally cut into stone instead of forgotten in a company ledger marked flooded, relocated, no further inquiry required. The whole valley turned out for the service, including, awkwardly and at Ezra's own quiet insistence, the boarding house widow and the 10-year-old boy and his mother, and a good many others who had spent 3 decades calling Augustus Preed a good neighbor, without once asking what that goodness had cost. Wren stood at the graveside with her hand in Ezra's, and thought of her uncle Cassius, buried alone in a Tucson churchyard with no one but a gravedigger to mark the day, and understood, finally and completely, what his crabbed note had truly been asking of her. Not simply to keep a worthless plot of land out of the wrong hands. To finish a 30-year watch he had kept alone for as long as his failing lungs allowed, and to make sure that watch was not wasted the way so many quiet, careful men's lives are wasted, unrecorded and unthanked, in service of a truth nobody else was ready yet to hear. On the plot of land Dobbs Preed had once called the finest patch of nothing in the territory, a new house was rising, timber by timber, its foundation set deep and true beside the shaft that had once been sealed with dynamite and lies. Wren worked the framing alongside Ezra most afternoons, her hands, once soft from a life she no longer recognized as her own, now calloused and sure. The lined shack was gone entirely, replaced by something built to last, and some evenings, when the work was done and the desert sky turned the color of old amber, they sat together on the new porch and said very little, because there was very little left that needed saying out loud. One such evening, as the lights of Amberlode began to flicker on in the valley below, Ezra leaned on the porch rail and nodded toward the town. "The silver recovered from the shaft," he said. "Commissioners putting the territory's share toward a proper schoolhouse, and a new sheriff's office, one that answers to the territory instead of whoever's richest." Wren nodded, her gaze moving over the world they'd built, the solid house, the new well drawing clean water from a spring the old survey map had never even marked, the silver still running rich and unbothered in the dark beneath their feet. The new schoolhouse the territory's silver share had funded opened that same spring, and Wren had found herself, almost without deciding to, standing at the front of a small, clean classroom 3 mornings a week, teaching sums and letters to a dozen children who had grown up in the shadow of a lie their parents never knew they were living inside. It was not the life she had planned for herself when the parish school in Tucson closed its doors. It was, she was slowly coming to understand, a better one built not on the thin, borrowed ground of somebody else's charity, but on 11 acres she had bought outright with her own $6, for the sheer stubborn reason that no one else believed it was worth the trouble. "Everybody in that town laughed at what I paid for this place," she said finally. $5, Ezra said, something that was almost a smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. They weren't wrong about the price. She looked at him, her eyes clear and steady in the fading light. They were wrong about the worth. The silver wasn't the treasure, it was just the key. She looked back out at the valley, at the home they were raising from ground that men had once tried to bury under a lie. "This is the treasure," she said. And in the last gold light of that desert evening, they went back to work, one nail at a time, building a life that no auctioneer's gavel and no rich man's sneer would ever again be allowed to call worthless. Thank you for staying with us to the end of this story of buried truth and quiet vindication. It's a reminder that sometimes the deepest value is found in the very things the world has already decided to throw away. If Wren and Ezra's journey moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd leave a like, and let us know in the comments, what would you have done the moment you found that trapdoor? Be sure to subscribe for more stories like this one. We'll see you next time.